As Moscow struggles with defeat, Beijing has quietly deployed an extensive espionage campaign, infiltrating Russia's scientific and military systems alike. China's fundamental secret: Putin's ignorance means he'll always be deceived. Professor Ming Zhuzheng, Taiwan's leading scholar on Chinese politics, once recounted a unique experience from his student days. He took a course called Chinese Communist Ideology, taught over 2 semesters. On the very first day, his professor said, "In the first semester, I will teach you how the Chinese Communist Party thinks. Because the CCP has a worldview, view of life, and view of society completely different from ordinary people. If you don't understand how they think, you won't understand why they act the way they do, and you certainly won't be able to predict their next move." According to that lecture, learning didn't stop at reading theory. Students had to debate, argue, and practice thinking like a real communist. In short, the professor said, in the first semester, I must turn you into communists. In the second semester, I will turn you back. After returning to National Taiwan University, Professor Ming realized a worrying truth. Taiwanese society knows far too little about the Chinese Communist Party. Precisely because they don't understand the CCP, people are easily deceived, and the Chinese Communist Party is exceptionally skilled at deception. He argues that to truly understand them, one needs not just to read documents, but to perceive the pathology in their culture of power, something that foreigners, even those fluent in Chinese, find very difficult to sense. According to the professor, the CCP has a pathological sensitivity and pathological obsession with power. Every action they take, no matter how moral or righteous it may appear, ultimately comes down to one question: how do we seize and consolidate power? Political power, in their thinking, is paramount. He gives an example. Jack Ma, or Ma Yun, had enormous wealth, but in the end was still removed from the game because he had no power. In that society, money is only temporary. Once you hold political power, you can take back everything. The professor recalls a classic saying his teacher once taught him, originating from Lenin: "Dealing with capitalism is very easy. They will even buy the rope we use to hang them with." According to him, this is the logic that runs through every action of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao Zedong once said, "To deal with the Kuomintang, we have 3 great treasures: party building, united front work, and armed struggle." But according to Professor Ming, there are 2 more treasures that few mention: cultural propaganda and espionage. In total, there are 5 pillars: party building, united front, armed struggle, cultural propaganda, espionage. In his lecture, Professor Ming Zhuzheng particularly emphasizes cultural propaganda, the soft propaganda tactic. He describes how the CCP operates as follows. On the surface, they engage in exchanges, cooperation, discussions about culture, religion, tourism. They can even discuss Mazu worship, feng shui, cuisine, or golf. But the goal isn't genuine exchange. Rather, it's to gradually build a sense of harmony, familiarity, and trustworthiness. This is precisely united front work, making friends to exert influence. They will find common language with you, cater to your interests. If you like money, they talk about money. If you like food, they talk about food. If you like golf, they play golf with you. And from there, gradually, they bring up political viewpoints. At first, it's statements that seem reasonable, then gradually transform into shared beliefs. Before you know it, you've been brainwashed without realizing it. According to Professor Ming, cultural propaganda is an extremely sophisticated and cunning form of propaganda. You think you're just chatting about ties, fashion, or culture, but in reality, you're being led into their political ideology. The ultimate goal is to make you accept and legitimize their power, becoming someone who sympathizes and eventually consents. Their lowest platform is talking about coffee, fashion, or tourism, but their highest platform is getting you to accept their domination. Understanding how the Chinese Communist Party thinks isn't about copying them, but about protecting yourself from their manipulation. How much do President Putin and the Russian people understand about Beijing's cunning schemes? Russian intelligence documents label China as the enemy, revealing deep-seated suspicion. A leaked internal document from Russia's Federal Security Service, FFSB, shows Moscow has labeled Beijing as the adversary and harbors deep concerns about Chinese intelligence infiltration. According to the 8-page plan accessed by the New York Times, Russian authorities believe China is expanding recruitment and espionage operations across multiple critical sectors. The document warns that Beijing is actively recruiting Russian scientists, intelligence officers, and dissidents within the system, particularly those with access to technological data, military information, and advanced research. The objective: to gather sensitive information to monitor and predict Russia's strategic moves. In the context of the Ukraine war and Arctic tensions, the FSB believes disaffected individuals are the easiest channel through which to access Moscow's military networks, infrastructure, and information. According to the document, Chinese intelligence is believed to be monitoring Russian military operations in Ukraine, aiming to decode Western weapons and learn modern tactics. Additionally, Beijing has deployed espionage in the Arctic, exploiting mining companies and university research centers as cover to access scientific, environmental, and military data. China's use of civilian infrastructure, ports, research stations, to conceal military activities increases the difficulty of verification and hides the true nature of their actions. Part of the report mentions China's potential to lay the groundwork for future territorial claims, particularly in sparsely populated and strategically important border regions, where Moscow has little actual control. This concern isn't unfounded, as the geo-economic complex in the Far East increasingly reveals itself under the gravitational pull from China. Though on paper both nations declare a no-limits relationship, the FSB describes this as an intense battle of wits in the shadows, friends on the surface, enemies from within. The golden opportunity. Russia collapses, China acts. In October 2025, as the Ukraine war enters its fourth year, the world witnesses a new configuration taking shape. Russia comprehensively weakened, while China quietly prepares for a historic move. Many analysts worry that if Moscow collapses, Beijing won't miss the golden opportunity to expand northward, reclaiming territories lost to Russia over a century ago. Diane Francis, American-Canadian editor-in-chief of the National Post, emphasizes, "It's not hard to understand China. They are master opportunists, and Putin is the one inadvertently paving the way for them." Over the past decade, the West believed Taiwan would be the first target of China's expansionist ambitions. But according to Diane Francis, that was never the real plan. Beijing doesn't need an invasion. They only want to pressure Taiwan into accepting the one country, two systems model. According to Francis, China is playing a 200-year chess game, and they know their moment has arrived. As Russia gradually loses control, Beijing can intervene on humanitarian grounds, protect border interests, or step-by-step establish economic military presence in Siberia and the Far East. Every scenario is being prepared in advance. Diane Francis warns, when Russia loses in Ukraine, their center of power will disintegrate. No one, not even Putin's successor, can hold together a country spanning 11 time zones. On the eastern edge lies Manchuria, territory China has always considered stolen. They want it back, and they will get it back. She believes Beijing is fully prepared militarily, diplomatically, and in terms of media to act on the day Russia collapses. A propaganda campaign could be launched under the banner of restoring historical justice, accompanied by humanitarian aid and cooperative reconstruction of border regions, the opening move for China to gain actual control over Russia's far eastern territories. Chinese call for reclaiming Siberia as Russia loses in Ukraine. The strategic earthquake after the war. A video spreading like wildfire on Chinese social media has shocked Russian public opinion. Millions of views, tens of thousands of comments, all revolving around calls for Beijing to reclaim territories once belonging to China, but seized by Tsarist Russia in the Far East. The clip asserts this is the historic moment to restore justice, recalling the treaties of Aigun, 1858, and Beijing, 1860. Documents the Qing court was forced to sign, ceding millions of square kilometers to Russia. As the war in Ukraine causes Moscow to decline, this psychology of territorial revenge has suddenly surged more powerfully than ever. Dr. Fred Hoffman, former U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, former military attaché to China and Asia expert, states bluntly, China may be helping Russia in the war with Ukraine, but make no mistake, Beijing is just waiting for Russia to weaken before making its move. If Moscow collapses, they will quickly seize back the territories that once belonged to the Qing dynasty. Trust me, it will happen. Dr. Hoffman recalls the past, in the 1950s to 1960s, when the Soviet Union was a superpower and China was still poor and hungry. Back then, the Soviet Union was the big spoon in the Soviet-China brotherhood relationship, he analogizes. But now, roles have reversed. China is the world's factory, while Russia is merely a cheap raw materials supplier. From energy and minerals to infrastructure, Moscow has become increasingly dependent on Beijing, especially after being isolated by the West. Every Chinese child is taught about the century of humiliation and unequal treaties, and Russia is always mentioned as the biggest land grabber, Hoffman adds. According to analysts, videos calling for territorial recovery aren't just random acts. They reflect a nationalist trend being deliberately cultivated within China, a tool to consolidate the regime's legitimacy during times of global upheaval. If Russia collapses, Beijing may see it as a golden opportunity to expand influence into Siberia, a vast territory rich in oil, gas, rare metals, and with strategic position bordering the Pacific. A liberation painted with historical justification will easily activate national pride among hundreds of millions of Chinese. Trust me, the Russians understand this very well, and they are terrified to the core, Hoffman concludes. While China dreams of Siberia, Moscow is reeling from within. Famous propagandist Maxim Kalashnikov, who once served in the state media system, suddenly admits Russia is failing. Kalashnikov says the war is no longer just a military conflict, but a comprehensive attrition campaign, striking directly at Russia's economy, logistics, energy, and public morale. Successive attacks on oil refineries, pipeline pumping stations, and the Nord Stream gas pipeline are gradually paralyzing Russia's economy. Initially, Russian media tried to hide the crisis, but outrage from pro-war Z-bloggers caused the propaganda curtain to collapse. Commentators who once cheered for inevitable victory are now publicly calling for withdrawal from Ukraine. These admissions, though few, are enough to show that Russian morale has collapsed before the military does. China spies on Russia, the shadow war between two allies. After the leak of internal documents from Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, labeling Beijing as the adversary and expressing deep concerns about Chinese intelligence infiltration, Russia-China relations are entering a phase filled with suspicion. On the surface, both nations still present themselves as comprehensive strategic partners, but behind the scenes, distrust is growing daily. Xi Jinping increasingly shows irritation with how Putin is conducting the war in Ukraine, an endless war dragging Russia into the quagmire and threatening Beijing's long-term interests. China understands clearly, if the West decides to intervene more forcefully, they could be dragged into a global confrontation they don't want. Beijing needs Russia as a shield against the West, but cannot let itself be dragged down with Moscow. The paradox is that Xi still wants Putin to survive because he has invested too much in this personal and strategic relationship. A weakened Russia still led by Putin would be easier to control than a chaotic Russia where a successor might not follow China's trajectory. Therefore, Zhongnanhai both supports Putin diplomatically on the surface while secretly guarding against and monitoring their own ally. In mid-2024, a series of reports from Russian cybersecurity companies revealed a shocking discovery. Computer systems of many Russian state agencies had been infiltrated, and technical traces indicated origins from China. These attacks didn't destroy systems, but quietly installed backdoors to monitor internal data, defense projects, and Russia's energy sector. Notably, the hackers didn't target the Ukrainian military or NATO, but rather their own allies' infrastructure. Alongside the shadow war, Beijing is expanding another war, the economic war. Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013, has become the most powerful tool for China to expand global influence without firing a shot. BRI is a massive network of railways, seaports, highways, and energy corridors connecting East Asia to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. By the end of 2024, 147 countries had signed on, accounting for nearly 2/3 of the world's population and 40% of global GDP. With this project, China isn't just pouring capital into infrastructure construction, but also expanding financial control, forcing borrowing nations to depend on Beijing's conditions. Many BRI contracts contain clauses allowing China to demand debt repayment at any time or prohibit borrowers from cooperating with the West. Russia, in the context of being isolated and needing money, chose to participate in BRI, hoping to leverage Chinese investment to compensate for losses from sanctions. But in reality, the Kremlin understands very well that BRI is gradually replacing Russia's influence in Eurasia, forcing Moscow to dance to Beijing's tune. Putin once praised BRI as a desire for cooperation, but behind the diplomatic pleasantries, Russia fears that BRI is dimming its own regional role. China's transcontinental trade network runs through Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Russia's Far East, where Moscow once held absolute control. Currently, China is heavily investing in railway lines and cross-border bridges connecting Manchuria with Russia's Far East. From there, Beijing can easily control the flow of goods, energy, and data across Eurasia. Though Russia has never acknowledged the risk, experts believe this is the first step in a strategy of soft control replacement, turning Siberia and Russia's Far East into economic dependencies on China. Moscow's official response remains denial of all suspicions. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova insists both nations resolved all border issues back in 2004. But the truth is that laws cannot protect influence when real power is gradually shifting into Beijing's hands. Russia needs China to survive the crisis, while China needs Russia as a shield and strategic stepping stone. But behind the friendly facade, both are quietly calculating. Beijing uses technology, trade, and infrastructure to absorb influence, while Moscow, though knowing it's being monitored, must remain silent because there are no other options. As Russia's economy is depleted and its military exhausted, China becomes the holder of the survival key, controlling energy, raw materials, supply chains, and now even Moscow's data flows. Therefore, on the day Ukraine declares victory over Russia, China may achieve de facto control of the Far East without firing a shot. That will be the first step in a new Eurasian order, where Beijing replaces Moscow as the center of power.